happy Friday, almost the end of May. And to all of our veterans out there listening, Happy Veterans Day just sounds kind of crappy. So for those of you that served, thank you for your service and thank you for putting your family and yourself on the front lines of protecting our country. So we have like Hollywood Squares going on here today. I didn't quite know how to figure out with the layout and trying to figure out like what do we do here. So we're pretty excited to
Yeah.
have quite a big lineup talking about the Verizon data breach report and whatnot. So let's give Mr. Snur and go round robin like we usually do, and everybody the opportunity to say hello.
What's going on? Thanks for jumping on. Tim Schnur, Inquisitive IT. We do individual security. We also do cybersecurity advisory, IP advisory. Big show today. A lot of big turnout. I wasn't expecting Mr. Golden, my, Team Tim here. And Jesse had a baby a little earlier, I think, than we expected. So, yeah. Jesse, you're up.
Hey, Jesse. Hold on. Let me do the things.
Yeah, actually, it worked out because I wouldn't be here if we had the baby when we were supposed to. So we were scheduled for Tuesday. Baby came Sunday. So we got a 5-day-old at home right now, and things are going good. Mom and baby are healthy and recovering well, and I'm getting as much sleep as possible. But Jesse Miller here with Power PSA Consulting. We help MSPs build and scale security programs and do that profitably. And like Tim said, super happy to be here and excited for the conversation today.
Yeah. Hey, Heath, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great.
It's been a hot minute, hasn't it?
It has. It's I know that you've been on the move with all the conferences. I know Tim Schnur and I talked earlier in the week. We had a little FOMO going on and missing that. But my name is Heath Spencer, CEO of Traitware. We're on a mission to kill the password because it's still one of the number one ways that people are getting beat up out there in the world. And we think there's better ways to do it. So, passwords suck, and we should fix that.
Passwords suck. Love that. Richard, my friend, good to see you. Let me make sure I've got the right things going on here. We'll change this one. We'll change that one. Pull this one up here.
A lot of moving parts.
I know. I'm trying. It's easier when it's just the 2 or 3 of us, but when it's 6, I can't keep my head straight.
Richard Connor, Lockstock Cybersecurity and Compliance. We help companies prepare for audits, pass audits, remediate audits, gain new business through security requirements coming from prospects and existing clients. We also work with MSPs to help them expand their services to more cybersecurity consulting services. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're happy to have you here. So let's see, who's up? Mr. Jason, how are you, my friend?
Hey, I'm good, Tim. Thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk with you guys. Jason with Intersectus. We're an MSSP. We work to do a lot of the same things that we're all talking about today, making sure that clients stay secure and helping them go through the compliance process, understand what that looks like and how it relates to their security needs, and just making sure everyone's doing their best to work together. So I'm excited to talk about this topic today. I know it's something that we're all pretty passionate about.
Love that. Awesome. Thank you for joining. We're so excited to have you here. I suppose I should probably do my own intro. Hey, everybody. Tim Golden, founder and CEO of Compliance Scorecard, where we help your MSP have the risk conversation with your customers by utilizing our uncomplicated compliance scorecards. It's almost like I practiced that once or twice.
I feel like we got the whole security program covered with the 6 people in this room right here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Mr. Schnur, you had a couple of questions that you were posting in the green room. Like, where do you want to start? Because there's a lot to dive into here.
Absolutely. And I know that the 6 of us went into the Verizon Breach Report that just was recently published. It's a very interesting report, right? I mean, insurers use it. It's got a lot of data. I don't know how many attacks or surveys or data points they had, but truly something. This coupled along with the FBI report that comes out every year, just figuring out like what are the 5 common attacks, right? And what are the causes or vulnerabilities that were left open and that the attackers exploited. So it was, we could probably pull it up, Tim. I don't know if you have it. Share. I could share maybe some of the screens, but some, I would say most of us who read it here. I don't want to speak for anyone, but not a lot of surprises, but some small shifts and some small trends, I think, that are probably alarming. And what can we do, to what are some of the critical defenses that we really have to focus on in 24 to make sure ourselves and our clients are protected. So we want to go around the horn. I don't know, Tim. I mean, Heath. Yeah, there we go. There we go. And I think page 2. I love this little infographic here of, like I said, not a lot of surprises. There we go. What are the, what vulnerabilities or not vulnerabilities? What gaps were exploited? Right.
It's interesting
Vulnerabilities
to
being
see
one of
that.
them.
It's interesting to see that credentials is still one of the biggest buckets, right? And then when you tie that into web-based applications, right? So from sort of my perspective, I look at this and I think, are people ensuring that they have multiple factor authentication on their web-based applications? Since credentials is one part on web-based applications, right? So if I'm a small business and I'm thinking about, hey, I use QuickBooks Online with, my dog's name is my password and no other form of like, it's really interesting to see the correlation between credentials and web-based applications.
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't we throw it on to Heath, because his business, I would say, is pretty focused on creds and authentication and access, right? What are your thoughts on that? And
Yeah, so I mean, credential-based attacks have been the number one vector, I think, across the last 4 Verizon reports, which has been still the theme. However, how the bad actors, the threat actors, are obtaining those credentials has shifted some in this report. We're seeing more strategic, whether it's through social engineering, strategic phishing attacks, where they're doing a lot of what they're called pre-texting, where there's, where they've got into some low-level business email compromise and they're setting the target up to then compromise and access control. And it is kind of surprising to me that, as everyone moved to the cloud and it's all external networks, identity, especially during the pandemic, became the perimeter. And the threat actors, it's the shortest path from A to B, right? And that's also noted in the report, right? So it's the easiest way for a threat actor to succeed. Not that there isn't an uptick in other, whether it's CVEs. One of the things that stood out is I think there's always been supply chain risk. However, I think the supply chain, when we're looking really strategically at the MSP space, the threat actors have really upped their game on trying to attack that type of supply chain to get in. And it is still using, how many MSPs are using web applications for either managing endpoints for customers, et cetera, remote networking capabilities. It's a web application and your credentials are going to get you in there. So what are you doing to add MFA there? I know a lot of the struggle or the pain points there is they need different agents to be able to respond to a ticket or whatever else and work on a machine. And, doing shared access gets very complicated with a lot of the legacy MFA platforms that are out there. But I do think I'm encouraged by how many web applications are finally making the shift to adopt modern identity standards, whether that's, SSO standards like SAML or OIDC, or moving towards FIDO-based passkeys type situation, et cetera, which allows modern technologies like ours to be integrated. But we need those service providers to accelerate that timeline and then not charge an SSO tax for its use.
Yep. Jason, Mr. MSSP, talk about, I guess we don't usually have a lot of MSSPs, right, on the show, but talk about your, any thoughts on this? Any the way you approach your clients, the way you talk about how you prioritize, right? Like what are, credentials, and he just broke down like SSO, passwordless, FIDO keys, the stuff you're, I'd say a lot of MSPs, outsourced IT providers aren't using state of the art, right? Like in terms of pass keys and things like that. Is that something you guys are using, or what are your,
Yeah, it is, and those two numbers that we just put up there, those are two of the numbers that stuck out to me when looking at the report. The one other number was 180, which was 180% increase in exploited vulnerabilities as you're seeing breaches. So, for us, we're huge fans of what Heath and the team are doing at Traitware. We use it internally. We use it for a number of our clients. We're actually, really excited about Microsoft and Mac OS getting together and seeing that Entra ID can now be passed down through to the login screen here. So, we're getting to a place where we can help companies try to solve this BYOD. How do we properly secure our systems? We believe in zero trust architecture and layering a SASE solution on top of that for a lot of clients, and making sure that we're covering all bases here, right? Business email compromise is still the number one attack vector for most organizations, and it'll stay that way. And so if we can do a good job of helping people understand the human element of it, do some training on that, but also help protect them from themselves in a lot of ways with, advanced solutions like a Harmony, email and collaboration solution, or other things like that, where we're getting past a secure email gateway and being able to help companies, use their solutions that they're used to using in a way that keeps them efficient and doesn't hinder them, but also keeps them secure. So that's why we see things like Traitware and even, securing your web browser, right? Like how many times do we see these web apps that you just you go into it, like we started the conversation off with, and if we were to put a little security around that, we could have a full-fledged solution for companies and keep their employees working as quickly as possible. So that's where we're spending a lot of time focusing on that and building out, our ways to help companies deal with these exploited vulnerabilities. So attack surface management, vulnerability scanning, and we're moving towards autonomous pen testing. So making sure that we can go into a production environment and run a solution or a scan that's going to not just identify vulnerability, but it's going to show us, hey, if this is vulnerable, here's all the different areas that we could potentially see something, move through a network and what that looks like to a threat actor, so that we can be truly proactive for our clients, and not just reactive to, hey, we're going to just hope you don't have a breach.
Yeah, it's interesting how we still see. I guess I'm trying to say is the best way to approach this, right, is how do we get the most mileage out of our security program and our security spend, right? And I think it's interesting that we look at, passwords continue to be an issue. The human element, I think, I could be wrong about this, but I thought I saw it's 68% of the breach, right?
Yeah.
So the human element continues to be the largest thing, and I think that's pretty unchanged from 2023. So I might be, maybe saying something a little different than people here, but I don't think we can change that human element much. I mean, how much have we talked about education and we do our security training and we do all these things? It's going to continue to be the highest involvement of a breach that we see. So how can we mitigate those things, right? Can we do things like secure passwords? But how can we could have Traitware installed everywhere in an environment, but if we have 3 applications that we didn't know we had and Traitware's not installed in those and not controlling those, that's a chink in our armor. So it goes back to, I think attack surface management is one of the biggest pieces that companies can start to do, and focusing on an attacker's view of the environment, right? So what do we have that's externally exposed? How is it vulnerable? Are those vulnerabilities actually exploitable, right? Rather than just checking a bunch of boxes, and then making sure that we have plans in place to protect that and mitigate the attacker's view of the environment.
Yeah, I would imagine that Richard's got huge thoughts on this, but I am excited to see the CIS Controls get at least a mention in the report now,
Yeah.
and then moving in a direction that's giving people
Shocking.
recommended paths to take to do that. But Jesse, what you just talked about is, is number one, right? Is what is an asset, as Matt Lee always says. And then
Right.
if you don't know what your asset list is, you can't secure it, which you just said. And we find that a lot, like as we go into companies and then they don't realize how many legacy applications actually had dependencies on their local AD. And even though they've moved to the cloud now, and we took away their password, and that legacy application doesn't know what to do. And then they discover, oh, we were using this tool. Well, it might have helped if you knew you were using this tool prior to doing something new, right? So I'm sure Richard's got thoughts on the audit side of like, how do you know what you have?
Yeah, Rich, what do you think?
Well, first, before I touch on that, I want to talk about that human element and what Jesse said about that thing's not changing. I agree with the current state and the current approach. It's not changing. These numbers, we're talking about what has changed from last year's report to this year's report. It's pretty consistent. So we need to consider about how we are actually doing the training. If we're going to continue down the training route, how can we improve the training? How can we make it more engaging? Some of the best feedback I've heard is when people actually see what happens. Like people are told not to do certain things. If you include the why and include more simulation about what happens, I think that really helps ground and help people understand why they are doing what they're doing and how to prevent these things from happening. On the other side of the human element, we need to think about things in terms of defense in depth, that if one control fails, we have other ones set up. And we talked about MFA. There are vulnerabilities within our MFA as well. Which MFA are we using? Are we using employees' personal devices? Are they text-based? Which is one of the things that was not talked about in the article, which has increased dramatically over the years, is SIM swapping. There are products like Afani that help prevent SIM swapping attacks. And also there are some vulnerabilities found in authenticator applications. So the authenticator should be tied to the device, but we're finding that some of these authenticator tools, they're in the cloud and they can be accessed from different devices. So if you have a device that is compromised, you can still gain that MFA access. And the others, one more point to that is, if there is such a human element, what are we doing to look at user and entity behavioral analytics? What tools do we have in place? What types of automation and AI, simple AI machine learning models? There's a great book, one of these O'Reilly books, Machine Learning and Security, that I keep here on my desk as a desk manual that talks about different things that you can monitor from a user behavioral analytics perspective to know what is normal behavior and what is abnormal behavior. Right. Touching on the CIS controls, it is good to see those referenced. I dropped in this chat, and you might want to share out with Tim. They have a nice publication on policy templates using the NIST CSF controls. All of these things need to be grounded in very good GRC practices that tie directly into these technical controls.
Yeah, I found it interesting. You talk about GRC, and I was just having this conversation with an MSP about, NIST versus CIS and how NIST with the governance piece. I find it interesting that Verizon referenced CIS versus NIST. Anyone have thoughts on that?
I just bite my political tongue.
Tim just said the word politics. I think it's a matter of who's influencing which section.
I think CIS really just taken off, right? I mean, I think a lot of people are embracing it. I mean,
okay. So here's the difference, right? NIST is the organization that develops the standards, right? We all know that. They have a framework. I also have CSF. I love the fact that they
I don't want to call them the standards. Yeah.
Right. Well, I call them the standard because if you look at everything else, they're based upon 853. Okay, off my right.
It's the National Institute of Standards, Tim Schnur. Come on, man. What are you talking about? I was kidding.
The standards. Yeah.
Exactly.
Tim Golden.
If you've looked at what CIS has done, they've actually been able to take a practical and pragmatic approach to some of that stuff, right? A prescriptive approach. approach, right? If I scroll into, control number 742, like, how do I do that? What does that mean? Or a category of controls. Whereas CIS is actually provided like step one, find your stuff. Step two, figure out what's on it. When you look at the entire 853 catalog, what? Right? And so, I look at NIST as like, here's all the stuff, right? Here is the assembly line. Let's go build the Ferrari, picking and choosing the things to build the Ferrari, right? Here's the
So,
menu. Let's build the dinner.
so
Well, and I
yeah.
think to your point. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Richard.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
That's a great point. It's excellent for an insider to be able to leverage CIS controls. But the reality is, a lot of these other frameworks are grounded in NIST, and you have things like the HIPAA security rule for healthcare. Well, what about manufacturing? What are they using? COBIT?
Yeah.
Who knows? But what I'm seeing more and more from a industry across the board, if you want to be a third party of ours, we need to see something. And I see NIST pop up all the time. I see NIST 853. I see NIST 800. NIST CSF. So NIST is showing up all the time in terms of audits and gaining business.
Yeah. I wonder, just talking through this, to me, I think this report is meant to be, it's a public facing and a highly visible piece. So maybe, to me, CIS, maybe less political, maybe more, it's just easier to understand. And so that's what they're going to reference, right?
Well, I think you're also seeing the play out of like how the NIST, framework gets adopted into something like CMMC, right? So you've got NIST 800-171 that we then have CMMC come out, and we've seen the like terrible way that that's been executed from some extent, right? Of like, here's our policy review time, here's the time now that we're gonna now go back to everyone and just keep pushing these deadlines out. So it's a confusing message to people when you have, hey, this is important, we're going to do this, we're going to make sure that all of our defense contractors meet this level of compliance, but we continue to push that date out and out and out just because we don't really have all those things ready yet, maybe to go in prime time. And I think NIST CSF did that a bit as well, right? Now we've got NIST CSF 2.0 because we missed an entire section that we should have actually developed better. And so I think for us to talk about the human element and the other piece on that with third-party suppliers, right? Like, now we've got to look at ourselves as a third-party supplier, and do you have a TPRM program that's reasonable for a small business today, right? Like, I don't know of one out there that really makes a lot of sense for a small business to try to figure out how they're going to go and hold their suppliers accountable to security controls that they themselves are being held accountable to, right?
Look, even top 5 global companies are struggling to hold their supply chains accountable.
Absolutely. Yeah. So and I think that's exactly where we see like some of those issues where the human element is going to continue to be there, because that human element is on your internal side and your vendor side. So now we're just compounding the effect of that without a good way to kind of address that across all industries.
Do you think we see a CIS governance control category in the near future?
Yes.
So there's
version 9, right?
There's a version 9 in the works. It's quite possible that there are some things that are going to kind of have better alignment with the industry as a whole. Again, back to Verizon Breach Report, right? Back to I can talk frameworks all day long. You know that, right?
I think it's important though to set the stage here, right? So
yeah, Tim. So the CIS controls that were in there, was that surprising? And my next question is going to be, what are some things that are not basically prescribed by CIS that we should be thinking about? I mean, I think we got 6 people on the call here that have their own opinions on what's in CIS and what might not be in CIS to protect against some of these attacks. But did you find that, like, I don't know, you've read through the report, Tim, did you find that helpful in terms of, what they're recommending? As you stated it before, like, where's my stuff, right? And like, how is it accessed? I mean, I think it's a little convoluted because they talk about vulnerabilities on here, they talk about credentials, but like, let's face it, most of these attacks are a combination of multiple, you know, there's not a lot of there's not a lot of CVE. If they're air gapped, you can get to them. Like, they're not going to like. Usually, it's like a phishing attack to execute a script through the web browser or something like that. So it's not. I don't think it's as clear cut maybe as we want it to be.
Well, I mean, I made the correlation in the beginning, right? So big spike in credentials, right? And also big spike in web-based applications. Those two things kind of go hand in hand, right? Right? If we have piss poor credential management and web applications not enforcing, and I hate to say SSO tax, right? Not enforcing the ability to have either single sign-on or multiple, authenticator methods, like it's almost like, well, duh. We're still dealing with two-factor. We're still dealing with web applications being an extra fee to have that kind of stuff. Like, it's no surprise to me that those two things are correlating together, and also a much, because, I mean, let's be honest, social engineering, getting passwords, data leaks, all of like getting those credentials isn't that hard, in the general scheme of things, right, Heath? And then being able to.
Right. It's not hard, which is why, in Richard mentioned this earlier, right? Like, it's no longer okay just to use a lot of legacy based MFA. And Jen Easterly talks about it a lot. She was mentioned in this report, right? That the time has come. You have to move to phishing resistant MFA to actually have something that's going to work, which means that you need to be using transparent factors as the multiple factors that the person doesn't know or can enter, right? You've got to move to things that if we look at the triad, right? People, process, technology, the commingling of those three things is the vulnerability, and why the human element's at 68%, right? It's people, process, technology. When you look at the technology, web applications, and the process is to enter a set of credentials. Well, if those are enterable, even if your OTP is enterable by the person, it is not difficult to get the human to make that mistake, which is why that's still a 68% number. And so we've got I believe, obviously I'm very biased, that there is technology out there that can help the people process to reduce the chance that the user's tricked into sharing those shareable secrets. But we need these service providers to recognize that they, because a lot of the other aspect is a lot of the requirements or frameworks. So I don't want to go back down the framework thing, but like things like the FTC safeguards rule, when you read the fine print of that, they're now requiring you. So if you want to talk about compliance, to actually have logging and attribution of which user do it, which means you need centralized identity management. You can't just have disparate identities. You can't log them if they're disparate, or it becomes very difficult or unattainable to track them if they're disparate identities. So we need service providers to recognize that to meet frameworks, you've got to enable businesses, even SMBs, to have centralized identity management, which means SSO most likely, right? Then make those available to do that. So service providers, the tricky part is that service providers will always still have a requirement for a direct service provider login, whether that's at account creation, someone signs up for a service the first time. Well, you can't configure single sign-on when you're creating the account. So there's always going to be a service provider based login. That's what's typically used for recovery. So if that's what's typically used for recovery, that's also the low-hanging fruit for the threat actor, if that's the back door. So what is the service provider doing to provide strong phishing-resistant MFA at that service provider-initiated login that isn't through a central identity management-based login? So those are, service providers, I think, need to solve for both of those equations. Their direct login needs to have strong authentication capabilities, and they have to allow for SSO, for centralized identity management.
Well, and Heath, I think you bring Yeah, you bring up some good points. I was just gonna say, like, from a service provider level, right? Like, not to go back into frameworks, but seeing things that CompTIA is doing with the cybersecurity trust mark and the way that, like, there's a desire to move towards an established standard so that we do have something that is kind of that baseline to work from. Because I think we can all agree, right? Like, most people that were stuck in Vegas and couldn't get into their hotel rooms because MGM got hacked were a little annoyed that a service provider got tricked into giving somebody access to something they shouldn't have. You could probably argue for all day long about how that never should have happened, and there's all these different controls that should be in place, right? But, like, look at how complex of an organization that is and how easily they were targeted. So how easily could you be targeted as a service provider, and what does that mean to your business, right? Because at the end of the day, we're protecting businesses, and we are businesses, and businesses run on profit. So that's the motivator that moves the needle on a lot of these things. You saw that move the needle for the insurance industry when they didn't know how to underwrite cyber insurance, properly. And so now, hey, that 1-page PDF is a 15, 20-page form now that you're attesting to all of these controls being in place. And we now have precedent for those not being done properly and what that meant for people trying to make claims on those policies, right? So I think the same thing continues to move down in how we address the implementation of things like third-party risk management, the human element, exploited vulnerabilities, because businesses have to decide, where do we spend our money? And it's our job as the consultants to say, hey, these are the high items that you can address, and it's going to take X amount of money to do this. And this is why there's value there for you, right? And so starting with things that we can take care of pretty easily, like passwords and stuff like that, is always a great place to start from my perspective.
A bigger pain point for people. So just 4 weeks ago, the CEO of UHG, Change Healthcare, had to go before the Senate and Congress in hearings, right, and admit that it was a password without MFA on it that was the issue that is going to run a tab of north of $100 million in climbing, right? Just, it was a $22 million ransom, but that's not the remaining damage.
Right.
There, just this last week, one of the largest nonprofit healthcare systems just got hit. And that is much more scary for the everyday person than just not being able to check into their hotel room at MGM. Sorry, but
absolutely,
it's there's so many things. And so at the service provider level and at that supply chain attack, that's what had the 180% growth this last year, is that supply chain attack. Those industries are taking a beating, and so Ginny Easterly also pushes secure by design, and I hear all the time about secure code and what are you doing, and especially if you're building out APIs, which are all critical things. But I'd love to hear more about secure by design when you're just talking about the human access point.
Yeah.
I love the human access point.
Right? We're like, look, there's three primary buckets of identity, right? There's application identity, there's machine or endpoint IoT identity, right? Machine identity, and then there's human identity. And all three of those things, as part of people, process, technology, have to communicate back and forth. The number one problem, 68%, is the human element. So where does the human have to access it? We had a very interesting conversation with a very large company recently that there's actually, people don't think about this. And again, secure by design, there are times that a human needs to function as the application when they're updating something or pushing code or whatever else it is. So how do you actually attribute it was the human that logged in and made these changes when they're logging in as the identity of the application? So just, crazy things to think about when there's a human access entry point.
Well, and I think, Richard said something early on that I think is really important, and I think it's really not addressed in the Breach Report, right? This is kind of like this is like nerd junk food, right? Because we all love to dive into this data and say, look, this proves my point, right? And I think you could spin it a bunch of different ways, but I think Richard was really on to something when he said, this is about layered defense and building a protection strategy for a company. And that's why I think what's not mentioned is what we just talked about can vary wildly from company to company, right? If you don't have a large attack surface, or you don't have a large crown jewels applications that you're using and it's in-house, or whatever that may be, there has to be somebody at the helm of the ship creating a strategy and looking at the risk that each critical application poses, then designing a commensurate program with layered defenses for that. And so I think what's not mentioned is that strategy and a plan really needs to happen first. And I think that's something that I think is missed by the breach report. And I think, again, why I do give a tip of the cap to NIST for bringing in the governance piece this year, you know?
Yeah. I 100% support that, Jesse. And it goes back to like knowing what you have, because you can't build a risk profile if you don't know it exists.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It's security is a byproduct.
That's my love language.
Byproduct of quality, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, a lot of the, so they're recommending CIS controls as panacea, I guess, for a lot of these attacks. But what are, I'd love to go around the horn, just like unconventional thoughts. Like a lot of things aren't in CIS controls, right? Like FIDO2 keys are not in there, right? And I don't even think password managers. I was just looking through some of like my core tenants, or like core 5-10 things I do from a cybersecurity program, like when I'm working with clients. Any thoughts? Like, there are no silver bullets, right? But are there things out there that you recommend clients that are unconventional, right? Like that don't really line up with CIS or NIST? I think we've kind of already heard it. Like clearly you're doing things that aren't prescribed by CIS or any of the frameworks, right? So I think those are really big things. Like I've posted on LinkedIn about UB keys or pass keys, right? Like they can basically act as a speed bump and severely disrupt like a kill chain on like 5 of their 6 of the most attacks, right? I mean, password managers not using unique, complex, long passwords, right? Like they just say on CIS, I was just reading it, like make sure you're using unique passwords, but it doesn't tell you how to get there, right?
Yeah.
And I know password managers are controversial as well. Like we don't have the fire blazing in the background. It's probably not fire worthy, Tim, but
trying to keep up.
Sorry, I'm lagging a bit. I'm getting you guys fine. You're not getting me. Okay.
I've got something for that.
Yeah, go Rick.
Unconventional. Well, it's mentioned in NIST, but in a different context. I think the business impact analysis provides a lot of value to all of the things that we're discussing here. I believe that is a foundational cornerstone document that serves for all of these other items. And one of the things that's captured in the business impact analysis that we talked about, Tim, you dropped in the chat that PHI is selling for $60 a pop. Well, one of the things that was mentioned in the Verizon Breach Report was that PII is targeted more so than the PHI. And that's one of the things that can be yielded out in the business impact analysis is what type of data do you have? And it starts setting up your strategies for protecting that data.
Yep.
Why?
You can't open a credit
Why
card
do we
with,
not talk?
blood type, right? Or like what color is his eyes? I guess maybe that would help, but a lot of the PHI you can't monetize.
Why do we not talk business impact analysis more and more and more? Right.
Yeah.
So
That's my mission for this year.
A lot of the MSPs don't even understand what that means, right? However, they're trying to have these risk conversations with their customer, and they don't even know the difference between likelihood and impact. Well, maybe they do. I'm not trying to, belittle them, but really, as it boils down to, and the collective we at MSP Geek last week, risk appetite, or I hate to use the word risk appetite, right? But really being able to have what is the business impact? Let's just even throw cyber out the window, right? So I'm working with, mom and pop bakery who does probably not care about the computer, but certainly cares where the milk is coming from, where the egg is coming from, right? That actual business impact that affects their revenue. So when you start to tie risk to revenue, with a vehicle or a tool like a business impact analysis, it can really start to narrow down into what they, what they're willing to spend money on, right? What they're willing to protect, that kind of
Yep.
stuff.
Tim, anything
Yeah.
else
I mean,
unconventional?
you look at like the fair reporting method, right, for financial risk, and like how that impacts, an organization. But I think one of the things that I see often is, depending upon those organizations, when we talk about third-party risk management, it's really hard to get data around what that impact is for a company that isn't of an enterprise level, right? Like, what are we, where are we getting any of this? Like, you go talk to an average small business. How many pieces of PII do you have? How many records do you have? No
They don't
clue.
care.
Like, just like how do you even quantify that? So it's really difficult to give accurate, accurate impact analysis to some of these organizations when there's no way to properly audit that. And I think the data discovery and data classification piece and ways that we're seeing generative AI help with that, and be able to go into it to an organization that maybe they are using SharePoint, which not going to recommend that, but maybe they are as their file system. But we can actually go through and say, hey, great, we're going to help you do data classification so that you do know the impact of what you have and what your responsibility is. And I think that's what a lot of it boils down to, right? Like, who's going to be responsible and who's going to step up and say, hey, we know we've got to do these things because X, Y, and Z to make sure we're doing a good job and we're a good, business to work with, essentially.
I'm sorry, are you talking about Control 2 of CIS?
Yeah.
What do you have and what's on it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unconventional, I'll tell you something that recently ran across with an engagement, and I think that is a miss by the CIS. I hope to see it in the next version, is deception. I don't think we talk about that enough, and it gets missed a lot of the time. And you talk about small business or SMEs, right, mid-sized organizations that don't have a good grasp on a sprawling technology landscape. What's a way to give yourself some room and some breathing room to start getting a longer implementation cycle done, is to get deception in some good spots, so you at least get that detection going on if an attacker's in the wire, right? And I recently had a larger client, international, who went through a CIS risk assessment with them. Had a lot of work to do, but being the VCSO and making a strategic decision based on everything I knew about the environment, I said, you guys need to put deception in as one of your first controls. And of course, the leadership team says, well, how much will that reduce our risk? And I go, 0. on your report, it's going to reduce it 0, but you guys need it. And so we talked through it, and they ended up going with it. And I think it was a smart move. But that again goes to that captain of the ship, that leader, that strategic minded person who's taking all that data, and to your point, Heath, being the application, there's no easy button for that, and saying, hey, I think we need to do this. We don't have a quantified justification for it in terms of our CIS control score, but it's needed, and it's going to give you some breathing room. And so I think that's one unconventional thing that we should talk more about, maybe as part of an initial mitigation strategy when we're coming into an environment.
Well, Tim Schnurr asked a question of like, well, CIS isn't actually giving you all of the, when you look at the people process technology, and there's a huge, like a lot of CIS is process and not just technology. But only a small component of it is technology. And, we are highly excited to be working with people like Jason at MSSPs and MSPs. And pretty much, if you're an MSP today, you have to by default somehow become an MSSP, because if you're not doing security, you're not going to last in the industry. And we need those experts and people like yourselves, Jesse, to then use CIS as a way for people to make an understanding of, okay, we got to know what we have. We got to know what's on it. Then what do we do to make educated decisions about how best to protect it or defend it or get alerts or some, creating a honeypot, as you just said, those kinds of things that may not show up directly as a risk score or as a potential immediate financial benefit, et cetera. But the frameworks or recommended protocols are always going to lag behind innovation, which means they're also going to lag behind the threat actor. And it's the job of the people that are doing implementation to stay educated on what do we need to do to be proactive and moving ahead and using innovative technologies inside of the processes that CIS aligns to.
Agree with that, Heath.
Richard, you mentioned Fani, right? So like that's clearly not in any of the frameworks, right? Like, I mean, that's a tool that's stopping SIM swapping, right? I mean, so do passkeys and to some degree.
Yeah,
but,
we do. Our technology would prevent that type of a
SIM
takeover
swap.
also.
Yeah. Go ahead, Richard. Sorry.
I was just going to say I agree with you, Heath, but I think it is important to consider that in this report, it was called out explicitly that these are the same attack vectors, it's the same technology used. So yes, that's coming. It's going to be AI versus AI attack versus AI defense, and we need to prepare for that. But this called out the current state is it's still the same techniques, tools and techniques being used for these breaches.
Path of least resistance is going to always win.
Yep.
Yeah. I agree. And so let's take a pragmatic example. Again, one thing we haven't talked about is misconfigurations. I think are still the largest vector of data leak, right? So we talked about all this stuff. How do we prevent misconfigurations? Again, asset management and a good CSPM, cloud security posture management program, right? Yep. But what do we do in the meantime is we get our ASM, attack surface management tool, turned up and monitoring. If something, pops up, we want to see that. We have deception in the environment, tokens within the cloud in specific spots. So if an attacker gets in before we get our stuff in place, we can at least get notification and respond to that. And so again, it's that it's to your point, Richard. It's the same old, or more the same. And so maybe Tim. I know we wanted to get here, and maybe I'm giving a little bit of my answer away. But I mean, do we shift defenses? That's the title, right? Do we shift defenses at the end of the day? Based on what we're seeing in this Verizon breach report, I'd love to hear from everyone in the room. What's your take on, are you changing your approach or your strategy based on what you've seen in this report and what you know about the state of the environment today?
I guess I'll go first. Yeah. I would say, if MSPs are not taking that proactive approach, and if they're not starting to deal with the things that we've been telling them to deal with, as Verizon keeps reporting year after year, that is one attack vector that seems to just keep coming up. With all of this generative AI, all of these, Richard, you mentioned it earlier, right? Machine learning, that attack vector is going to start to shift, right? And I think we as MSPs or MSSPs need to get ahead of it. I think we need to not just train the humans and deal with that human element like we keep saying over and over and over again. Humans are never going to change. So we need to get better at being preemptive on some of those behavioral things that humans are doing to try to stop them before they, unbeknownst, do bad things. Where how do I say this without letting cat out of bags? There are certain vendors in the channel that are looking at that human behavioral analytics and starting to shift the way that training is being done. They're starting to shift the way of how we're protecting that human asset by bringing into those analytic pieces, like the behavioral pieces.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I don't want anyone to misunderstand and hear me that I'm saying we don't need end user training, right? But I think what I'm saying is we need to do it, but it's only going to stem the tide, somewhat. We're still going to have that there, and for me, I think my shift for this year is changing the way that we do asset management, and I think we think of asset management, historically as getting a list of all our computers, their expiration dates for their maintenance, what software do they have on them? Well, it needs to be less that and more what are the attack points and what are the external attack assets that we have in our environment that attackers could use to leverage as an initial vector in an attack. And I think thinking about asset management that way makes it much more manageable rather than trying to boil the ocean, right?
Yeah. So I mean, asset management interesting, right? I talk about least trust, lean function, right? Like basically limiting exposure. And when you look at CIS controls, you look at NIST 171, right? Like how do you think about that as like a small business or even a small security team? How do you start to think about like starting from nothing or starting from zero trust and starting, it's almost like everyone's always behind on the asset management, right? Like
Yeah.
there's always things Keith mentioned, like legacy technology and right. I think that's one of the biggest challenges is getting people in this mindset of like, how do I limit things, as you said, attack surface management, Jesse, right? But like, how do you not just try to like fence around the herd earlier than that and think like, all right, the herd's beyond the fence. Which ones are we going to bring back into the fence? So hopefully that doesn't happen to you, but it's going to.
Well, going back to the very, page 2 of the report, right? Web applications and credentials. Now you bring in, when we're talking about asset management, people's ability inside of a company to just go spin up an application. Oh, I need DocuSign. So they go self-register for a DocuSign account, right? So the shadow SaaS aspect is rampant and not talked about a lot. But it's a component of that web application and credential-based attack, right? So what, especially in the SMB space, they are struggling to, solve that problem. This person went and signed up for this tool and they don't know they signed up for that tool. So what are you doing to monitor that type of web application access? Again, then going back to CIS number 2, what data did they put out there? And it could be, a dev engineer that needed some sort of live data to go test something. And they took real data and put it over in this S3 bucket and you didn't know they did it. And then when they were done with the project, the S3 bucket's still there because no one killed it, right? And so, those things are, I think, still part of that web application and credentials. And so how are you moving to do those, to deal with that as asset management? And, most of the SMB entrepreneurs are still just trying to solve how they keep their business running, let alone not deal with these things. And, Jason brought up earlier, like, well, how do we give that SMB a risk metric? Well, there's stats out there that say 60% of them don't survive after one incident. That's a pretty astounding stat. And so if you came to me as an entrepreneur of an SMB, which I am and have been since I was 26 years old, this is your risk profile. There's a 60% chance that you get hit once, you don't make it out of it. You might want to address that risk vector. Yeah. We've seen in the last 2 years, universities that I would consider mid-tier enterprise not make it after a cyber incident, close their doors to the campus. That's pretty significant.
So, Jason, what are your thoughts around this?
It's interesting, right? I think we talk about like how we define asset management. And I think a lot of this comes down to like the evolving definition of things within the security space, right? We think about proactive versus reactive, left of boom, right of boom. And we're seeing now that we went through COVID and everyone got to work from home. And so this new world of not living behind like that traditional walled garden and having a firewall at your office that you pay Meraki for every 3 years, and that's your security piece, right? Like now we've opened this up to like businesses, mobile businesses able to be in all these places. And so the part where I think we have to really focus in on is with the web apps and the credentials, like I mentioned, but are we doing things to proactively monitor those within your organization? Not just being reactive because there is a honeypot or a canary, or there is a way to know that someone's in there. Let's just assume that someone's in there, right? Like, let's just say, hey, they're going to get in. What happens when they get in? So being able to go in and do some sort of continuous vulnerability scanning, great. Vulnerability management, important. But I think ongoing and regular penetration testing being done to ensure that your network has, stability in it, that those zero trust pieces are configured properly to stop someone if they do get to this share or whatever it might be, and making sure that we kind of shift our thought around what it means to be proactive to be doing continuous monitoring and secure those pieces of your ever evolving sprawl of cloud solutions that every organization uses today, and make sure that those SaaS apps are secured. And there are some simple ways to do that are very effective. And that low-hanging fruit approach of, hey, let's do these things and then we can dive in where we need to for a specific organization, but let's set those standards up to make sure we're protecting everyone in a truly proactive way.
Richard?
There's been a ton of discussion on frameworks and controls, and the DBI report is kind of a public facing kind of report of all these different things. One thing that hasn't been really brought up today that we see, and I think everyone here would agree, is kind of the private sector stick that is going to drive those things, and is the side. And Jason mentioned it earlier, right? Cyber underwriters for the insurance are now the private sector stick. And if you look at like the 6 main criteria that they're starting to require for you to even qualify for a cyber policy, is that MDR, is MFA. I truly believe that there is going to be a shift from the cyber underwriters, that they actually start to define what qualifies as strong MFA. An SMS code, as Richard mentioned earlier, isn't going to qualify. And if that's what you're using, you no longer had best practice and we're not paying your claim. In our local area, a real estate brokerage got hit with a 7-figure judgment in court because the real estate agent didn't use best practice to protect their email inbox. And that's a fact. And so, they didn't have they didn't have any kind of MFA on it, let alone SMS. But I think you're going to see a shift from underwriters now determining, if we look at our, people understand what we've known for decades now in like real world property and casualty, right? So if your home doesn't have defensible space and you live in a high fire danger, you're not getting home insurance, right? Unless you do these mitigating factors. Exactly. If you have things like that, it's going to affect you.
So I want to give Richard an opportunity to chime in a minute or two here about kind of the asset stuff. And then I know we're winding down, got about 3 minutes left, respectful of everybody's time because we tend to end at 3:00. I want to give everybody an opportunity. So Richard, do you have anything you want to add about the asset piece or some of the other things before we kind of dive into our one key takeaways?
Yeah, first of all, how does this change my approach? Well, not too much. We've talked about how, again, this is seeing a lot of the same things. Some of the increases were not that significant. They were marginal. One of the ones that I noticed was the extortion. That there's an increase in extortion where someone's stealing your data. They're not encrypting it, but they're just threatening to expose it to the public. I'm going to research that a little bit more and think about what type of mitigating factors to showcase to decision makers. This will certainly be used as a reference, as a tool to showcase value of taking these mitigating steps. In terms of asset management, the business impact analysis is an asset manager. You're taking an inventory of your business processes, which is a very important set of assets. It's taking an inventory of the components that are necessary to run those, and also your data elements. It also sets up your recovery point objective, which is the amount of data that you need. So if you have your data taken from you and you have it sets up motivation to set up your 3-2-1 backups, 3 different media, 2 different locations where one of them is off-site. It sets things up in those terms. So again, if your data is taken from you, it's like, okay, no problem. The only thing you can do is extort me because I've got everything backed up. In terms of cyber security insurance, I'm glad that cyber and security insurance has been perfected, and there's no problem.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, we'll just end there.
Kudos to Fifth Wall Solutions. They appear to be at least transparent with their process. I've talked to several actuaries. There's not a lot of data around cyber insurance and these attacks, so it's really difficult to even come up with a business model at all. So really, in terms of risk transfer, that really needs to be a last result, and we need to work on the upfront, the GRC assurance that we're considering the things that can go wrong and what are we doing to make sure that the right things are very easy to accomplish and the wrong things are very difficult.
All right.
Yeah.
We hit the 3 o'clock mark. Do I just end and tell everybody too bad, or do I give all of us a one key takeaway?
I think we've covered it pretty heavily. I'm good.
Yeah. Just, what's up next, Tim? I mean, I think we have Mr. Wayne next week.
So we are at the 3 o'clock mark. We didn't end with our one key takeaway for MSPs, which kind of bugs me because that's kind of how we always run this. I'll speak for all of us when I say, don't read the 100-page report, but read the 100-page report. Okay. So coming up next week, we're having Wayne from CompTIA to come and talk about the state of the channel and the report that CompTIA put out. For those of you that are not aware, CompTIA actually has a humongous research division, and they spent all of the time to look at like the state of the channel and the 5 or 6 or 7 or 600 key things that MSPs should be focusing on. And I wonder what one of those main topics is. Just saying. So there was I think a 64% increase in some kind of topic, but we're not really sure. We're going to get into that next week. So as always, we're so glad to have you here. Do the like and the subscribes. Richard, Heath, Jason, thank you so much. We hope to have you back on again where we can probably have a little more time to dig in a little more things. Any parting words? 1 word, 2 word, I'll go around the room. Richard, parting word.
Business and
All right.
analysis.
Pete.
BIA.
Jason.
Password suck.
Jason.
To all the MSPs out there, eat your own dog food.
Enjoy the weekend.
Yes. And thank you to all of the veterans that have served. Have a great weekend,
Absolutely.
everybody.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.